History is important for two reasons. First, we'll say history is important because there's an aspiration, we think, truly to truth. That's to say, we can learn things from the past, and that truth is valuable in itself. Second of all, history as a discipline is also important for the pedagogical and practical value that can deliver to individuals like Evan who are studying history. That said, our model is quite simple. 3 points. The first is that the debate in which we are having has to do with the lens by which we analyze time periods and events. That's to say, for example, when discussing the Cold War, whether or not your analysis focuses primarily on the economic and political leaders that were relevant within that context, rather than the broad experiences or cultural movements that, for example, ordinary people faced. Second of all, that means there is usually a difference in terms of the source on which your historical analysis is based. By virtue of the position that certain individuals that you would focus on our side of the house occupy, it is more likely that there's documentary evidence that substantiates your analysis rather than oral history that is most likely to be the form of documentation to which the experiences of the masses speak. Excuse me. Cool. Finally, third, the last point is that we are not defending cases in which it is inaccurate. That's to say, it is not our burden on our side of the house that to say, when discussing the dissolution of the Soviet Union, that we would credit Reagan with entirely destroying the Soviet Union, rather than, for example, also discussing economic institutions that had to take place in the Soviet Union. We have 3 points in this speech. First of all, we'll explain why their version of history ultimately fails to ascribe individual culpability and accountability, which is horrible for the ways in which we deal with truth and ultimately damaging to it. Second of all, we'll explain why ultimately their view obscures the most egregious forms of oppression that happened for that specific time period. Finally, third, we'll explain why this damages the ultimate pedagogical value of history, also really, really bad. Did you have something before then?
Like a point of information, not a clarification.
Yeah, sure, go.
Yeah. So like,
given that historians have traditionally spent a lot of time focused on studying great figures, and there are diminishing returns to research within any given field, don't you think it would be optimal to focus on unexplored areas of research rather than those that have been well covered?
No, this point seems to assume like we've studied enough history, and that means like that we're at the point where like the past is not worth studying at all. That kind of defeats the point. That is the assumption of the analysis of history in the first place. And we think ultimately the fact that you have ongoing discourse about some of the things that you find problematic about the quote-unquote big man history seems to indicate that those are cases in which a continued analysis can provoke discussion that is productive. Cool. Now let's 3 points. First of all, why is the case that their side fails to ascribe individual culpability and accountability? When it's the case that your historical analysis focuses on broad movements or quote-unquote the masses, it is the case, we think, that individuals ultimately are not themselves given culpability for the actions or events that happen. That is simply because the sort of ways in which you describe those events happening is a result of people who are nameless, who are faceless, and that any individual with respect to that movement do not themselves contribute wholesale to the existence of that movement. Ultimately, this damages the ability for us to learn, to learn what we think is the most important thing, which is ultimately to be able to learn from mistakes in the past. As cliched as that sounds, we ultimately do think that's an important goal of history. So on our side of the house, we think it's important that you actually hold historical figures accountable. That's to say, the environment in which those figures were raised actually means that they had a tangible impact, and as such, they should be accountable for those things. A good analysis of this is, for example, when discussing the Civil War, you can discuss whether or not there are broad movements that ultimately would have led to the Civil War, or it's the case that you can say that there are specific representatives that were present at Southern Congresses that made decisions that ultimately led to the Civil War, and it's clear in that case those are the sorts of cases that are more likely to ascribe culpability for those individuals for the ultimate outcome. We ultimately think then, and the other good example of this is, for example, when discussing the carpet bombing in Cambodia. It is the case that you can discuss the individual experiences of those individuals, and certainly we might do that as a means to hold those individuals accountable, but it is still Nixon that made that decision, and on our side of the house, the analysis is more likely to emphasize the fact that he himself made a decision that was ultimately important. What this underlies, that is on their side of the house, the vast majority of history that has happened in the past, this sort of big man history, is not laudatory on our side of the house. That's to say, it is probably critical, and as such, we think it is extremely productive to continue to the future with respect to those individuals that did actually have a big impact on those time periods. The other thing that this belies ultimately about what the study of history looks like on our side of the house is that we ultimately think that those individuals themselves are focal points for the sort of broad culture that they think are important. For example, it is the case that civil rights leaders embody a movement that is happening at that time that is representative of something that is important within the lives of ordinary individuals. But ultimately, what that means is that when it comes to discussing those particular movements, it is less likely on our side of the house that they'll be viewed deterministically. Because on our side of the house, we give you a way in which you can locate causation with respect to those different events, and as such, the takeaway there is much more likely to be in line with what we told you the goal of history is, which is to say that you can change history going forward. The second point that we have, though, is to explain why we think that ultimately obscures the most egregious forms of oppression that happened for those particular time periods. What ultimately happens when you have a focus on forces that are broad or ordinary individuals is that it ultimately means that you are, in many cases, buttressing current movements and the social progress or conceptions that current movements would rely on within those past times, within those past times, and to look beyond the sort of hierarchies that you think are really, really bad in the status quo. What that ultimately means is that in those cases, you do things like purposely look for instances of sexual minorities, racial minorities, etc., and attempt to analyze history from their perspectives. What that means is that in those cases, you are ultimately trying to uncover structures and forces that we think are just less important than the structures that we'd be more likely to focus on our side of the house. A good example of this is if, for example, when analyzing the Cuban revolutionaries, if you look at how their revolutionary movement excluded people like gender minorities, it is less likely that ultimately on their side of the house, you would do things like look at the ways that ultimately they suffered at the hands of the Batista movement, or how that obfuscates the anti-colonialism that we think was inherent to that movement. Ultimately, when it comes to the oppression that occurs within those particular spaces, there are certain forms of oppression that are more important, that are more likely to be focused on by virtue of the fact that you place more value on the sorts of things that are important for that historical time period and they give an effect in that time period, which is why on our side of the house we are more consistent with that movement. Yeah.
This doesn't make any sense at all. If you're doing a social history of the Cuban Revolution, you're obviously going to be talking about the oppression LGBT people face. If all you're doing is wanking off about Castro, you're never going to talk about that.
So no, we think that is clearly your side of the house in which you attempt to uncover these sorts of broad movements that shape the lives of those individuals. Moreover, it seems pretty evident from the sorts of POIs that you offer that the sort of current conceptions of what it is that we ought to be uncovering are more likely to seep in on your side of the house, which is why it's to think that we are more likely to obfuscate the things that are actually important. Cool. Now the third point is why we think this damages the pedagogical value of history. We think history as a discipline is important because it means that you can make claims based on robust evidence. We think ultimately on their side of the house, when, for example, you make claims based on the culture and ordinary individuals, it's more likely that you will make claims on the basis of evidence that is not just available or available in oral form. Ultimately, this means you have less document-based study, and we think this is bad for two reasons. First of all, it's the case that their study is probably less factual, and we think ultimately that a coherent history is useful because it gives us an idea of what actually happened with those cases, less likely to happen on their side of the house. But second of all, we also think that many students take history because it is the case that they can learn a way of studying, a way of writing, and a way of rigorous analysis that ultimately gives them useful skills, regardless of whether they actually remember the names of the figures within that time period. We think that's a useful skill that's damaged on their side of the house.
Thank the Prime Minister. Call up to the opposition.
Four things from opening the opposition. One, why we think there are significant benefits of understanding the cultural forces present in our own lives, especially for politics and development. I'm going to talk about why we think there are significant harms of obsessing over great figures, especially to modern politics, how this distorts our policy preference aggregation and leads to worse political discourse. I'm also going to talk about the types of mechanisms used to study cultural forces, empowers disadvantaged people, and how we think that studying great figures and great institutions excludes the experiences of people alive today. And we think the study of history, importantly, frames what we think is normal, frames what we think of as leaders, frames who we think of should be a part of what we think of as history. And we think studying the lives of ordinary people makes us better equipped to include those people in our modern discourse today. First of all, 2 points of responsive. One, we're told that it's important that we need this for culpability and accountability. The only examples he gives of are people who are not alive today, so we cannot hold them culpable. But second of all, we obviously talk about individuals, but discuss their actions as subject to forces and incentives that presented that action to them. The same way that we often talk about individuals alive today, being like they did make a decision, but it was subject to particular forces that we should attempt to take apart. This is it includes my second point of responsive. Responding to the Prime Minister's misconception about what a cultural force is. He says that we would study the movement of the Cuban Revolution, but not talk about any of the cultural forces that the Cuban Revolution was subject to. For instance, patriarchal forces, for instance, homophobic forces that excluded certain individuals. Understanding cultural forces is not just about understanding movements, but understanding the particular pressures that individuals were subject to. So, why do we think there are significant benefits to understanding cultural forces for our politics and development? notice that it is large cultural forces that has this most significant aggregate effect on people's lives. This is especially important for understanding state or social action, when that action always has to happen on an aggregate level, where it isn't possible for the state to control individual particular action or make individual decisions for them, or make individual decisions for great leaders, but it does need to understand what the effect of a moment in history, what the effect of a cultural force is on millions and millions of people. First of all, we think this gives us a better understanding of how those cultural forces represent themselves when we study them, when we study both their causes and how they play out in people's lives, not just studying the symptoms of the individual actions of particular leaders. We also think this means that we're better able to implement that in the modern day, because notice on their side of the house, the narrative is that we were able to explore and settle the southern United States because a bunch of square-jawed Protestant men said, over there, to the south, whereas really it was because we figured out really it was because of cultural forces, about continued expansion, and also because we were able to do things like kill mosquitoes on a significant level. We were able to change the way that people settled large pieces of territory. Notice that those forces were much more important for the individual lives of people, and so it's something that particularly we should understand when developing how states act. No, thank you. I think that leads to better policy decision making when we have a better understanding of how millions of people experience cultural forces, as opposed to an individual person makes particular decisions. I also think there are significant harms of obsessing over great figures, especially to our modern politics. First of all, we think this makes people want to be like great figures, but it means that they pursue personal glory, that they want to be a great man of history, they want to be part of history, they want to seem like that. But second of all, we think this means that individual voters, when history is presented to them as being about great men in education, in cultural myths, in their literature, and the art they consume, means that you're much more likely to obsess over the character of a politician. You're much more likely to obsess over their family values, or over how much they are presidential, which we think distorts how you're voting on policy, which means we are less able to aggregate policy preferences of individual voters. It also means that voting decisions or political decisions are much less analytical and much less rational. How do you debate with someone about whether a particular candidate is presidential or not? Because this is based entirely on socialization about what particular great leaders might look like, and it's completely subjective in the mind of the voter. But yet people vote against their own self-interest because one person looks more presidential than the other, meaning that we have worse policy and individuals have much worse lives. I'll take closing first.
Right. Studying cultural forces and individuals also leads to this type of focus, but instead on particular identities such as nationalism and race. Why is this any better than great man history?
So first of all, we think I think that refers to my first point, where we understand the aggregate effect on a much larger scale, which is important for when we make policy decisions about how that will aggregately affect people. But second of all, we think it is also much more important to understand individual identities and the intersection of them in other people, as opposed to just identifying one person and being like, well, he had one identity and it was that he was Winston Churchill, and that's the only mechanism we can understand for how history might work. And his other identity, for instance, the fact that he hated Irish Catholics with a burning passion, it does not enter into our consideration of how we study him. Thirdly, we think the types of mechanisms used to study this empowers disadvantaged people. Notice that not all cultures have a long written history, which we think the fact that opening government focuses exclusively on using documentary evidence means you cannot study, for instance, Pacific peoples. It's very difficult to study any sort of indigenous history prior to the arrival of white individuals. It's also very difficult to study those who were excluded from written history, those who were people of color, who were excluded from participating in the academy, women who were excluded from formal education, means that understanding their histories is very difficult on their side of the house. But on our side of the house, we say things like oral history, we say things like art and literature are also equal access to truth, and means that the individual experiences of people's lives today are reflected in history. The fact that history informs what we think of as normal and what we think of as relevant means that if we are able to understand that women and people of color fully participated in history, even if it wasn't in written history, means that we can understand them more as fully participating in our lives today. Go ahead, opening.
Cool. It seems like the explicit purpose of your history is towards the end of present-day decision-making. So does that mean you are conceding that the sorts of analysis you take up are things that smuggle in that present-day agenda into your analysis of history?
I do not think the fact that women should be 50% of the world and not 5% of history is not an agenda, but legitimate pursuit of the truth that women were 50% of the population and did more than 50% of the labor and did more than 50% of all actions. But men and great man history says that it was one man who determined how history functioned, and not all the multiple women that did all the work he was supposed to be doing, but decided not to because he was president at the time. Not all cultures have. We think this means that it empowers individuals who would otherwise be excluded from history in the modern world, and it means that their cultures are no longer portrayed as primitive. It no longer said that you can't access truth through oral history or through ancient writing. Right? We think this study is equally as analytical and equally in pursuit of truth, and does not mean that you suffer in terms of the pedagogical benefits. But notice this is not great women history. This is not great people of color history. Even in instances where you're able to identify one individual, they include less than 1/10 of all the history that we study. Those individuals were definitely participating in history to the same extent as white men. And I think the fact that we're only able to study the maximum amount of white men, but a very small minority of individuals, means that we're less able to understand the modern world as including those people.
Okay, the leader of the opposition, Collins, Deputy.
Cool. Everybody ready? One big misconception out of the speech we just heard. On side opening government, our case is not, you should never talk about individuals that are excluded from structures of the past. The question is, when events happen that are shaped by institutions that are exclusive, how do you discuss that exclusion, right? Is it through purposefully trying to find the experience of those individuals, or relying upon the most concrete evidence that you have, which is usually documentary that unfortunately does exclude people, explaining, contextualizing, and reading in the silences as a strategy for analyzing the absences of history, right? The only other alternative that they have on their side of the house is to use the very few existing, recorded examples of the presence of those individuals within structures that excluded the vast majority of them to represent a phenomenon that appears in greater magnitude that it actually occurred, which has a lot of problems for them as well. 3 areas of the debate. First, I'm going to talk about modern lessons from history. Second of all, I'm going to talk about the subaltern and how we should discuss its presence. And third of all, I'm going to talk about pedagogy, which we hear no responses to. Recognize the majority of students of history are exactly that, students, and that actually matters, right? First, let's talk about modern lessons. So what OO tells us in response to our first point is that you can't hold the vast majority of big men accountable because they're dead. So first of all, in a ton of cases, this isn't true, right? So records are declassified before people die, and this is a huge way of holding modern figures accountable for their actions within government, within economies, within social spheres. But second of all, this isn't just accountability on a legal basis, such as arresting someone or making sure that they feel ashamed for the things that they've done, but rather it's individuals internalizing the fact that they are responsible for their actions and one day they will be judged, right? So in terms of the arguments we hear about people glorifying leaders, for example, here's the very clear comparison. On their side of the house, people naturally respect people in positions of authority, especially if you grow up in educational systems and structures that teach you to glorify them, such as thinking the president of the US or the leader of your country is really smart and powerful. The problem is, when history never declassifies their memos, when you never find the racist writings in the diaries, or the paucity of actual logic that underwent some of their decisions by robustly analyzing that figure as a focalizer of responsibility, you never find out that even great men's shit stinks, right? And that's what we do on our side of the house, is you actually contextualize and hold accountable those figures. So in terms of glorification and people entering the social sphere more responsibly, on our side of the house, throughout your life you are forced to reckon with the fact that you will eventually be held accountable for the things that you do, which is terribly important for the decisions that people make, even going forward. Actually, sure.
Is the role of the criminologist to tell us that OJ probably did it, or to tell us the broad factors that lead to crime and how we might best prevent it?
So criminology and history, first of all, are different disciplines.
Yep.
But yeah, so I think there is a role for that in another academic discipline. But moreover, you can still, the question is how you analyze that trend. I think focalizing it around OJ himself, which is more understandable and certainly has more concrete evidence that's specific to that case, is still a more effective way of telling the story of the context of that crime. Great, so what do we hear from them? It's just basically that like cultural forces influence more people, and as a result, you should study that, and you can implement it in the modern day. My question is like, what is the implementation you get this, right? If the lesson is there's a culture of like exclusion of a broad group, right? The power structures in the modern day still exist and are still overwhelming. There's no clear-cut like one-to-one implementation of the type of cultural lessons that they talk about on their side, right? If anything, it reduces the idea that individuals are culpable for fighting those, right? Because if the answer is always, we study individuals, but at the end of the day, they are powerless against the zeitgeist of the forces into which they were born, why does one individual ever have to stand up against that culture when it is racist or when it is classist? Clearly, you get much more movement on those issues with our philosophy. Great, second area that I want to talk about is the subaltern and how you ought to discuss it. So what we hear from OO is that it's impossible to study people like indigenous groups or racial minorities because they're excluded from the archive, they're excluded from written sources. So our history doesn't say, wow, you know, there are no great books in like the 1700s written by women of color. Obviously they didn't exist and they didn't write. It analyzes that gap in the record as evidence of exclusion, right? That is the very point. So we still tell the story of the literary landscape and the cultural forces that influence that. The problem is that that gap itself is the best evidence of exclusion, when instead you use the very few sources that you do have of popular literary figures to analyze the experiences of this. It is so much easier to get two types of responses. One, people can say there wasn't as big a problem of exclusion if it's the case that these sources and records do exist in enough abundance to create a coherent history. Or two, you say this is inaccurate, right? Like the magnitude of the impact that you're ascribing to individuals through only a few existing cases is inaccurate, and as a result you get stronger backlash to this history that is more damaging than simply acknowledging the gaps as we do on our side of the house. But second of all, they ignore Henry's point about obfuscating types of oppression. The problem is oh, I'll take you now, actually.
Okay, on your side of the house, when you find gaps that women haven't written, you say, oh, well, there weren't any great women because you never studied the cultural force of patriarchy. If you want to study the cultural forces of patriarchy, you're on opposition side.
Great, that's not true. The question is, when you study those cultural forces, through what lens do you look at them? On our side of the house, when you study literary institutions and the decisions and documentary evidence that they create in terms of book submissions, publications, invitee lists to like salons, the absence of women there gives you evidence of exclusion and of the same culture that you want to talk about. The question is, what is the lens through which you look at that? But finally, what I was trying to say is, there are very real forms of oppression in the past that now seem less significant because we have progressed to a new phase of social contest. So an example of this is the fact that a movement in Cuba, despite the fact that it excluded women and gender minorities, which is terrible, was still incredibly positive and justified in its contestation of an oppressive regime, right? On their side of the house, if the focus is on the way under new lenses it excluded people, that obfuscates incredibly real oppression that we think within the context of time is really, really important. Finally, no response to the fact that individuals, the skills of writing and communication, clearly better served on our side of the house. So proud to propose.
Any your phone?
Yeah.
Take the Deputy Prime Minister, call up the Deputy Leader of Opposition.
Sorry, I just one moment. Sorry. More to open that. We good? Okay, just one point of framing before we begin. Like, obviously this is a debate about emphasis, insofar as both sides of the House are sometimes going to talk about the fact that Ronald Reagan made some decisions. The question is, we're looking at what are the motivations for that. So presumably on their side of the House, they're looking at this internally. They're looking at what is Reagan's individual decision-making. When talking about splits in the Catholic Church, we're looking between the Catholic and Orthodox churches, we're looking at the theological disputes that happened there. On our side of the House, we're presumably talking more broadly around what is the broader cultural context of this in the Cold War, seeing Reagan as one of many possible leaders who could have led the Cold War. We're presumably going to look less at the precise context of the theological disputes over transubstantiation that split the Catholic and Orthodox churches, and look more at the mass migrations of different groups of former barbarians into the Western Roman Empire as creating an entirely different political and social basis for this. Just one sort of random point of framing. Okay, what I'm broadly going to talk about here is the different types of societies, because I think OJ have been remarkably unnuanced in assuming that a number of societies operate broadly on a Western liberal democracy basis. I'm going to talk specifically about states where there is a lack of access to history, post-colonial states. We're going to talk about post-conflict societies and post-genocide societies, and we will talk about countries with significant racial and ethnic division within them. First of all, some miscellaneous points of rebuttal. Okay, number one of this pedagogy and robust evidence stuff. This is genuinely bizarre. So first of all, we get the attack that on our side of the House we might smuggle in a present-day agenda. I'd point out they obviously do that as well, insofar as it's a staple of social science that whatever it is you're looking at, this is colored to some extent by the perspective from which the reader is looking. I think it's much more dangerous on their side of the House to pretend this isn't happening. To say, no, we're stepping back, we're looking objectively at the actions of Reagan or the actions of Charlemagne or Castro or whatever, as opposed to recognizing, no, this is influenced by our own biases here. Secondly, we're told this comes on a less factual basis, and the attack here is to point out that there are some problems with oral history. This is the least comparative piece of analysis I've ever heard. Obviously, there are some problems with oral history and some difficulties in interpretation. This is equally true of written sources. We shouldn't pretend that just because something is written in a book it is objective, whereas because something is said it is non-objective. Obviously, there are problems with weighing up both sources on both sides of the House, but I don't think we're given any comparative reason to believe it's necessarily worse on our side of the House. At least we have the comparative benefit of we're able to read written source on our side of the House and also listen to oral histories and also look at other types of collecting history that they've set themselves in opposition to. Secondly, they tell us it's important to learn rigorous analysis. I have no idea why this isn't true in our side of the House. Presumably the analysis of anything is more rigorous in our side of the House if the sources are more difficult to look at or whatever, if we believe they're trying to be true. I think this is largely nonsense. So, what are the better stuff that they bring us to? Okay, first of all is on glorification. So, Evan tells us that because we have a natural respect for authority through education, it is better that we see that their shit stinks in order to lessen this respect. But I think she's missing the initial starting point of that, which is why do we have a natural respect for leaders? Part of that is because we're raised to respect them, but I think a huge part of that is history education, where we're taught that the reason we should need to respect the president so much is because his actions will shape history. Because the actions and decisions of Donald Trump or Obama as an individual that will shape history and change the world and set it in place for centuries going forward. I think it's plausible that if on our side of the House we're instead saying, no, I mean, like, Obama was ultimately very limited in terms of his freedom of action. He was carried along by certain social forces. Even if you didn't have Barack Obama elected, you'd have had another similar political leader at the time or going on later in response to concerns. The fact that even if Donald Trump narrowly loses to Hillary, the forces that put him in place, the anger at globalization, rising unemployment, falling economic prosperity, all remain and will all influence politics going forward. Presumably if you're analysing that on our side of the House, you're less likely to have this natural respect for leaders in the first place anyway. But I just dispute that looking at their diaries and seeing their shit stinks necessarily leads to fallen respect or fallen glorification for these leaders. Far more likely you get the obsession over how clever Napoleon was and what a great general he was and what a great leader when you look at all of his individual actions. I think that's far more in keeping with the truth of the matter we've had, that when you teach historical figures as important, you as a teacher obviously have incentives and you as a student obviously have incentives to view these as important, to view these as significant, which will tend towards glorification. I think the secondly she contends that this affects leaders going forward, that if you know your diaries are something to be pored over and analysed and historians are going to look at them, this might affect your behaviour now. I think, okay, maybe, but I think, like, how you're going to be perceived in 50 years' time after you're dead is just the least important of all incentives on a political actor's or political leader's behaviour. I think they tend to do it based on their own ideology, their own politics, how their actions are going to affect the modern day. Lastly, we get the claim that the problem with doing it on our side of the House is you might come to the conclusion that individuals are powerless or non-culpable. I'm going to talk about this in post-genocidal societies, where I think the reverse is far more dangerous, when you say the Holocaust was the responsibility of Hitler, as opposed to being the logical end conclusion of a trend of anti-Semitism that still pervades and infects the populations of Germany, Austria, and Poland, and virtually all remain culpable. But I don't think it is true that on our side of the House you think, oh, well, these individuals are non-culpable or immune. You recognise the social forces that are present on them, but you recognise obviously that they have freedom of action within that, insofar as there are lots of individuals and lots of counter-forces, and lots of people who didn't take these sort of actions and didn't do this sort of thing. So, the last claim we get from them is the idea that this overlooks certain types of oppression. Okay, so first of all, I just think this is bizarre. I think I finally understand the claim at the end of Evan's speech, which is we might look at the Cuban Revolution and overemphasize problems of homophobia or misogyny, as opposed to looking at colonialism as legitimate. But I just don't think this is a problem with doing it our type of history. I just think that's a problem with the biases and analysis you take with you going into it. Like you equally could have a look at the Cuban Revolution and just focus over much on colonialism and ignore the other types of homophobia or misogyny. Like I don't think looking at the institution of the revolution or looking at Castro as an individual particularly avoids any of those problems, or is particularly comparative in this. I think as well it's just horrifically non-responsive to a lot of the material we get. Like it is just true that people of colour, women, are less important institutions, such as say the Catholic Church. Like if you're studying the Catholic Church throughout the Middle Ages, you would just never talk about women if they were never present or never members of the Catholic Church. You necessarily need to exclude them entirely or to have any sort of fair or true history. We get the claim, well, at least we can analyse the gaps, but I think this is non-comparative, given so can we. Like we could also point out that there are certain gaps in literature by women of colour throughout the 18th century. The difference is, as well as pointing out the gaps, we can also look at what might have filled the gaps. So rather than intensify the perception that women of colour have always been powerless and voiceless, closing, I thought this is the first view I offer.
So if it is important to understand these people and the oppressions that they face, isn't it also important to understand the forces through which they were liberated, such as institutions, including the courts and the society, political institutions that exist within the society?
Yeah. Obviously we talk about those, but I don't think it's useful to just say, well, the abolitionists ended slavery because they were really nice guys. I think it's useful to look at, for example, the economic incentives that a number of plantation farmers have to end slavery, given that they no longer wanted to compete with, like, it was when French sugar colonies were added that a lot of British plantations turned against this because they wanted to disadvantage their rivals from importing any more slaves. But I mean, like, we obviously are going to talk about those institutions at some point. The question is what motivates them and what drives those actions. So, looking specifically at the types of countries we have here, I think first of all, with regards to post-conflict or genocide societies, there's a massive problem on their side of the house when you assign culpability to individuals rather than groups. Because the problem with this is it means it's much harder for you to do things like denazify or recognize collective culpability. This is precisely the lack of the blame of Hitler as being uniquely evil is a reason why we have governments in Poland and Hungary who are one step away from implementing a number of these similar racist policies that were implemented against Jews, against Muslims now, precisely because you never face the sort of conflict going forward. I think it's a massive problem additionally in post-conflict societies, where it means you're focusing overly much on the actions of generals, overly much on blaming the actions of Milosevic, as opposed to saying, hey, guess what guys, we were all culpable for this, we all contributed towards creating a political climate in which it's possible, in which these actions are permissible. For all these reasons, we urge you to oppose.
Thank you, Deputy Leader of Opposition. Colleague Member.
The study of great figures and institutions is one that ascribes agency to the people being studied. But precisely as closing opposition said, right, the Western-centric, there's been a Western-centric canon where the great white man history has already been studied, where there have already been ascribed agency. What we regret is that when the diminishing marginal returns they want to talk about kicked in, the academy, when it was forced to stop studying great white men because they ran out of them, decided that instead of studying great women, or great Chinese institutions, or great people of any sort of other culture, decided to start studying ordinary experiences and ordinary people where they wouldn't have to ascribe this sort of agency to anyone who wasn't a white man. That is what we regret on our side. What we are going to bring in extension is, first of all, why their side of history is fundamentally far more exclusive because of structural constraints on the resources. Second, we're going to talk about who actually dictates and determines the sort of history to study, i.e. culture. And finally, we'll talk about what is actually more useful to teach or achieve to solve social change, which the opening half wanted to talk about. Rebuttal will be integrated. So first, on why their sort of history is incredibly Western-centric and very exclusive. I think it's simply because the evidence of everyday experiences, which are necessary for their study of history, are far more available in the West than they are anywhere else. Several reasons. One, the existence of long-term surviving institutions like Cambridge or Oxford in the West, which don't exist elsewhere for a variety of reasons. Second, because of industrialism. That is to say, in the West, things like the mass media and the printing press, hold on a moment, which is associated with industrialism and their rise to power, also spread, like the writing to the mass to the masses, and there are far more written documentation of ordinary experiences than there are elsewhere, with the printing press wasn't invented as early. Yes, opening. You have it.
Yeah, so China also has universities, and paper recording was invented in China earlier. This just seems to be a claim that in the West we focus on Western history. Presumably in other countries and other cultures they will focus on their own histories.
Yeah, so this is why you should let me finish the point before you POI me. But the third reason is colonialism, right? That all of these fantastic Chinese universities and everything were bloody destroyed and burned to the ground when they were invaded by the West. And sure, they've kept the palace records, because, you know, maybe even if we don't think great man history is that important now, the colonial invaders who invaded China in the Opium War certainly thought great man history was important. So they kept the palace records, and so we have understanding of those institutions and those great figures. But they didn't bother keeping the writings of individual peasants or something, right? Just burnt all of them. And we lost a bunch in the Cultural Revolution anyway. So I think the upshot of that is that the sort of records that you need are far more present in the West than elsewhere. And even if they do exist elsewhere, they're far more inaccessible. Why? First of all, for the same reasons, they're much more dispersed and much harder to get and much less well preserved. And academic budgets are unfortunately limited, so you can't really access them. And so because of the whole diminishing marginal thing, you'll go after the ones in the West which are easier to access. But second is structural, right? That is to say that the Madrashipit Empire in Southeast Asia, which covered a very large part of Southeast Asia, had fairly common institutions throughout the entire region, which means you can understand institutions that much more easily based on those records. But if you want to study individual people, the means of studying ordinary people is via very in-depth ethnographies, and that limits you to a particular time slice and a particular geographic location. So if you want to study something which is far away and outside of the West, in order to do that sort of in-depth study, you just basically have if you want to study everything, you basically need to have a lot more resources to do so. And so you don't get that sort of study elsewhere, where it's not easy, where it is difficult, where you don't have those records as you do in the West. So you don't get these sort of aggregate impacts, which OO talks about. You get that from GDP figures or something, those sorts of things. You don't get those aggregate impacts, right? You never actually get that. You just get individual impacts of things. No. What are the impacts? First of all, the study of history and data is incredibly exclusive to Indians who doesn't exist in a society which has written records or any sort of documentation, very often, of people who arrive. No thank you. Of ordinary people. But second, that is an exoticism that exists, right? That the only way, therefore, to study the ordinary experience of pre-colonial societies or non-Western societies is by going to places which are not touched by colonialism, where those records were not destroyed or were not taken away. That's why the main example which we brought is the Polynesian culture and stuff like that. The problem is that those are precisely the societies that, because in the past they weren't that powerful, which is why they weren't invaded and colonialized, those are also the most primitive looking, as it were, of all the non-Western societies. And that's why the exoticism, which is so problematic, is created within the academy, right? Because you don't analyze or study imperial China if you don't want to understand the ethnography for ordinary non-Western, non-white people. You study Polynesian islands, but I mean, hate to break it to you, imperial China was a much bigger and much more powerful society than it was. You can only study that through great man history. No, I've taken over, I'll take closing later on when they happen. So I think finally again, that it goes back to what I said in the opening, right? This fundamentally strips agency from one who's a non-white man. That at the point in time where we have finished, hold on a moment, giving agency to people who have power in the West, it was high time that we started studying great black figures like Frederick Douglass, or great women like Emmeline Pankhurst, or great figures in Chinese history or Japanese history or Korean history, and we didn't do that because the academy decided to shift in the other direction. Yes?
Which factor provides us the best understanding on the aggregate of differences between countries' economic development today? King Leopold II or settler mortality in the 1700s?
Maybe the answer is the invention of fucking steam engine in the West, right? That's also an institutional, economic, structural thing, which is not dependent on culture. I don't understand that point. Okay, this is not King Leopold, it's the printing press or something, right? That's clearly more important. Okay. So that's the first one, why they're far more exclusive. I think that wins us around because that's what they've been talking about. But second, who understands culture better, right? And I think the idea is that the dominant culture is what's going to be studied anyway, because they're the ones which have most recorded. So when OO tells us that the narrative of Western expansion in the US is the square-jawed Protestant man, I point out that square-jawed and Protestant are two cultural identifiers, or the sort of identities that you have as Harry Potter the POI. Whereas, because that's the dominant culture of the time. So that's what ethnography is what happens. Whereas maybe the real answer is that there's an institution known as the railroads which were created by the extra economic institution of the steam engine being created, right? Maybe that, and the distinction that applies to everyone, because structures, tend to apply to everyone in that sense. No, when COPO is about O.J. Simpson and says criminology, yeah, exactly. We think it's much better than criminology focused on the institutions of economic deprivation for African American families, on Jim Crow laws, on the institution of the original sin of slavery, rather than focusing on, as Charles Murray does, the pathology of the black family. Because that is the only way we can describe culture, right? Fundamentally, if people have been oppressed, the only way to understand the oppression is by the structures that oppress them. Because you look at the only look at their internal cultures, you forget that those cultures exist for a reason. The reason those cultures exist are that they have been oppressed by those structures. If you look at the cultures, that's when you end up with saying that African American families for some reason have a culture of failure or something, and that is fundamentally not okay. Finally, on like what's actually used to teach, right? And again, I think I've clashed very clearly with OO, or like what OO. I think this beats OO very clearly, right? Because there's no great point like animating everyone to want to enact change if they don't actually know how to enact change. And institutions shape power, right? That's why, like, 2/3 of Americans are in favor of gun control, but you still don't have fucking gun control because the NRA controls like lobbies and like the decentralization of American politics. The fundamental problem is we think that it's much more important for citizens to know how to pass bills, to know how the courts are used to enact change, to know how these institutions shape power and what they can do, rather than simply knowing that they want to do something, but not an understanding of how it has been done throughout history, not of any role models to emulate. For these reasons, we need to go with closing government.
The great difficulty of debates like this, I think, is basically as follows. Somehow, to get an impact in this debate, you need to connect the sort of wonk sphere of the academic study of history with something that actually applies in the real world that is going to tangibly affect. That's the area that we want to talk about. We think that thinking about things like economic historians, people like development economists, who do study in these spheres and live in these spheres and then end up constructing policy, and the way that they look at history and view it is probably the thing that is most likely to actually tangibly affect things in the real world. We want to talk about why the study of institutions and great figures has made those sort of very real-life things substantially worse for a very large number of people. Before I talk about, first of all, the true stuff and then that particular thing, I want to rebut CG very directly. So their first thing is to be like, haha, without left-winged you, because your history doesn't take into account the minorities that weren't in the West and have their stuff studied, right? I think at a first pass, they have a very, very real evidence issue, right? Like, if you come from a colonized society, it's very unlikely your colonizers were writing down very detailed history of your great men and great institutions, right? They were simply writing stuff that was biased your end. And like, they explicitly give the example of China, a country that like purged a lot of its history to try and like reinvent itself in its own image. That's not a fidelity to truth, right? That's simply taking information that's likely to be heavily doctored and not particularly useful at constructing the kind of history of great men and institutions they wanted. Second of all, on exoticism, right? It seemed bizarre to me they thought that like relying on like oral traditions of Maori history that speak of their great heroes and legends would lead to less exoticism than studying like the height records or something of early Maoris in the economy after we have that sort of like decent data, right? One of those things is a factual observation about the quality of life. The other one is something tied up in like myths and legacy and things that try and accentuate the cultural differences and the exoticism of them as opposed to just like the factual reality of their life on the ground. First thing, about truth. I think that opening government right to concern themselves with the idea that evidence was a problem in this debate. I think they simply did not give credit to just how much kind of evidence we can collect. We can do things like get height data that indicates nutritional standards and the economic living quality of people on the ground. Things like the tools that were being used. Things like the records that we have historically written down things. Things like city planning that indicate the population centres and where people are living and the quality of life they have. These are a vast range of data that inform us of the day-to-day life of these people and let us build up that image of what society was like. By comparison, they actually have very limited info, right? Their information comes strictly from the spheres that these great men or women or whatever happen to live in, right? A very narrow thing. Often things that are simply designed to like big themselves up. Like reading someone's diary is unlikely to give you a particularly broad conception of society, but when you try and focus on that particularly aggressively, you tend to build up myths and blink your vision rather than actively focusing on the truth. And that's the second thing that I want to talk about, right? Like fidelity to the truth in this, within this sort of point. I think that Leopold II is not anywhere near as useful for understanding the Congo as talking about two particular cultural factors. First of all, the intermingling between Congolese culture and European culture that occurred when a large quantity of people were held effectively as slaves. And second of all, the cultural factors in Belgium that meant that people started to feel shame for this sort of thing and eventually led to the freedom of those people. Those two factors inform you of the circumstances by which Congo was decolonized, not thinking about just how bonkers Leopold II was. Sure.
So the mausoleum of the Qin Emperor exists and preserves what happened in Imperial China at that time because the Brits, when they came along, thought there was was pretty important. Unsurprisingly, they didn't think the recordings of any Qin peasants of the time were important, so you can only understand Qin China through the great man or great institution history.
I don't think you need writings to have a decent understanding of history, right? You look at things like corpses and you look at the sort of factual reality of what those bodies look like, you make scientific observation, that's how a lot of history is informed, right? We're trying to talk about the actual economic and tangible reality on the ground, not whatever myths happen to be passed down through whatever scroungy records happen to be selectively remembered by the colonizers that remained. Second of all, on policy making, let's be very clear, what the sort of wonk sphere believes is or is not true about history and the way that democracies rise and fall has tremendous impact on policy setting, right? For instance, economic history informs what policies development economics takes to government, and the fact that economic history has had particular perspectives has literally meant that certain policies and billions of dollars was poured into particular things because that was the way they viewed the only possible solution. Historians and international relations people, the way they view history and the rise and fall of democracies has very heavily informed international relation policy for most Western countries that have held the vast majority of power because those are the advisors who make these decisions. The difficulty in this debate, we thought, was tying the history to real things, and this is where we think we're going to win this run by pointing out to you this very real consequence. So why are the cultural forces, for instance, much better at doing this sort of historical understanding? We think it is because of the fact that they are just much more accurate in understanding the tangible realities on the ground and the things that are likely to go wrong when you try and implement policy. So for instance, the story of the decolonization of Africa or the radical changes of democracies in the Arab world in the 20th century, right, is the story of cultural divides between a generation of people who lived in slaves and a young generation that was emancipated and had to make a place and forge a new African identity. It's the story of lots of dispersed tribal leaders who weren't happy at the idea of centralized governments coming into power in Arab states and often undermined them as a result of that deep cultural sentiment to a form of government that was imposed on them most with very little understanding of the realities that they viewed the sort of power structure that should exist in society differently. Having an awareness of those very intimate cultural things, understanding what life on the ground feels like for those people and what they value as important is far more useful for trying to understand where the moving parts of policy can go wrong than simply looking at what the powerful people who happen to sit at the top of a country were or were not thinking or were able to be doing or how we can influence them. Sure.
Yeah, the only examples you have of this information, height records and things of that sort, can you explain to me how that is evidence for cultural history rather than economic history, which is not something that really this is what you guys are defending?
No, because things like looking at the tool records and the houses that people lived in shows you things about the culture, how the household was structured, right? Where people were living. Obviously the art, culture manifests as the places that we live and the things that we do, and we look for the tangible physical remnants of those things and use that to inform our judgment making. On economic stuff, right? Things like development economics can be incredibly okay, so with respect to development economics, we think the problem is basically as follows, right? When we focus on great leaders and view them as the only possible solution to sorts of things, rather than thinking about intimately what the actual person's quality of life is likely to be like, we focus too much on trying to build, say, institutions or what we can do within those structures, rather than thinking about the actual consequences of policy on the ground, right? So a good example of this would be a better indicator of what the economic and social political situation of countries in Africa is today, is not any sort of analysis of what the leaders in those countries were like. It's just settler mortality in the 18th century or something, or so Tom tells me. And the reasoning for this is apparently the fact that if you had a country that had very high settler mortality, you didn't build up good institutions, and that meant that countries weren't as developed. Now, the consequence of this, right, is basically as follows. We think that it's very important that economists recognize that the actual life on the ground and the sort of cultural sphere that policies involve themselves in is far more likely to determine whether that policy succeeds or does not succeed, rather than simply whether one particular institution or one particular person is going to be pro or anti, right? It's very important they view these sorts of policies from the ground up, from a granular level, because otherwise they implement things that are based on an understanding that's far too hierarchical and far less aware of the actual reality of these situations we oppose.
The member of the opposition, calling the government.
three areas of focus in this debate. First, the descriptive question. What focus of history is more important and consequential to how our world is shaped? Secondly, what ends up getting studied by academia, depending on what you focus. And finally, what is most useful to study, particularly for minorities and those who are oppressed. Let's deal first then with the first question, right? The front half, we get the clash between what is more important, cultural forces or like in leaders and institutions, right? They provide us the additional analysis that things like height data, like nutrition and stuff is very, very important to understand the facts and shapings of history, right? But I don't think they deal with Quan's analysis in that the ultimate and causal factor of everything that we discussed are the macro institutions that exist within society, right? Things such as patriarchy and capitalism that not only shape things like height data, but also shape everything else, right? How leaders are born and created, the ideologies that they have, and the feelings and experiences of real people, right? So, like, here's an example, right? Revolutionary sentiment and the desire for liberation is widespread, right? And these are the experiences of individual people. But the institutions within those societies shape the ways in which this manifests in very different ways, right? The degree to which the state oppresses them determines whether they do things such as protest peacefully or protest via violence, right? While it's the case that individual experiences are important, certainly we agree, what shapes those individual experiences is ultimately institutions, and those are the levers that shape the world that we live in. I think given that this is much more important, it is very reasonable to focus our study on these institutions, right? Secondly then, what ends up being studied, right? Because OG gives us a useful basis by telling us that documents and evidence exist to a much greater extent for leaders and institutions. What Quan uniquely contributed to you is the observation that minority cultures, that non-European societies, often the only evidence that exists is about important figures and institutions, right? And this just fundamentally was not dealt with when they don't engage with the facts of the world, right? Things such as capitalism leading towards things such as colonialism, which led to the destruction of a lot of these documents. Sure, opening.
Okay. Your definition of what an institution is has shifted greatly away. OG have defined it as things like organizations, religions, governments, groups of people. Trying to claim patriarchy or the steam engine as an institution is clearly a much broader prop from what we represent.
So, like, I think that certainly falls under our area of the debate, right? Things such as, like, capitalism and like inventions such as the steam engine or institutions like economic structures certainly aren't the experiences of ordinary people and not the types of things that they're able to defend, right? So what does all of this mean, right? Given that these documents are incredibly limited on their side of the house, right? This means that particularly given the very analysis that their back half provided to us, the diminishing marginal returns of only focusing on great white men, what happens eventually on our side of the house is that other historical figures that have been marginalized, such as women, such as those of minorities, are studied, right? Because, like, you know, like writing one additional research paper about Winston Churchill isn't as compelling as breaking new ground and then analyzing what previously wasn't, right? But the problem is that given these limitations that we articulated on their side of the house, the like individual level, the people and cultures just cannot be studied because of these structural and resource limitations, right? Or if they can be studied, they might only be able to be studied by like elite institutions as opposed to the vast, vast majority of historians that can't like travel to New Guinea and live there for years and study with New Guineans, right? No thanks. So why is this important, right? Because they might get study of forces and cultural, like cultures and forces of ordinary people, right? But their focus is an exceptionally Eurocentric one, right? They end up studying European citizens and their experiences during the Second World War, or those of settlers settling the American West, but never end up actually focusing on the individuals that we want to talk about, like those that exist in minorities and oppressed society, simply because this evidence doesn't exist for those people, but the experiences of individual people are in abundance in the West, right? On our side of the house, because information for leaders and institutions exists for both Western societies as well as non-Western societies, the focus on our side of the house is much, much more directed towards those people, precisely for the reasons that they mentioned, that it's more useful to break new ground and study new things, right? The only thing that back half then provides us is this argument that like, you don't really need textual evidence, we can study things like bone structure and things like that, right? But this again falls into the same two problems that we described, right? One, that this is extraordinarily, extraordinarily inaccessible for the vast majority of historians, but also if this evidence is so like unsubstantial and flimsy and non-existent, then the types of analysis that they lead to are not very productive or insightful or useful, right? right? That is to say, like, if the evidence doesn't exist, then they don't get very good history, whereas on our side of the house, the evidence exists in abundance, right? There is more than enough literature written by slaves. There is more than enough, like, writings of women, right? The problem is that those haven't been focused upon up until now, but our side of the house grants that focus. Sure, Becca.
So, like, which of the two things would you want the historian advising a government, like, say, about policy in the Arab world to know? Like, a history of Arab strongmen, or the cultural realities that mean that implementing policy could fail or not fail?
So I certainly think that, like, as we institute, all right, we're getting into that right now, right? What is most useful to study, especially for minorities and oppressed people, right? Let's give government their best case scenario, right? Grant them literally everything. On their side of the house, we learn about the experiences of individual people, right? We learn that African Americans were incredibly oppressed and brutalized by slavery, right? We learn that women were exceptionally marginalized throughout history and today, right? But the problem is that, like, with all this information, it's exceptionally unclear what they do with this sort of information, right? On their side of the house, perhaps it gives them some degree of insight into what that allows them to accomplish, but I think that equally provides insight for our side of the house, right? But what we say is even more important than, like, leaders learning what to study and, like, current politicians learning, because we think that is something that is fairly symmetric and unique on both sides of the house, is what individuals and the people that they want to focus on, what they learn and what they internalize, right? And I think only back half on our side provides that for you, because uniquely what we tell them is firstly what oppresses them, right? Institutions like patriarchy and capitalism, as opposed to just learning that these people were really, really oppressed, right? But more and more importantly, we learn on our side of the house how to help alleviate their oppression, right? That only us on our back half teach high school students and undergraduates what the levers of power in society are, things like courts, things like governments and legislatures, but also how to work within those institutions and help individuals alleviate their oppression, right? We learn, for instance, that the civil rights movement was fought and won within the courts, as well as learn how, for people in the contemporary society and the modern day, how they can access those institutions and use them to actually elevate themselves and alleviate their oppression. We propose.
It's highly unlikely that a modern-day policy solution to a huge issue that is faced in the world is going to be to resurrect some man from the grave and bring him back to solve all of our problems. Given that we believe that what's much more important to understand is the general societal factors which are important that tell us when policies may succeed and when they might fail. And that's why John's POI was so important. It's much more important to understand the force of pan-Arab nationalism and how the ordinary people on the ground who might resist an invasion or resist a given policy might react than understanding how Gaddafi rose to power and what individual decisions that he made during that process. We take the things that are most likely to be generalizable about the past and use those to inform how we see the present and how we see the future. And that's how we're able to get better results, better policy, and get closer to the truth. 2 points in the speech. First, what allows us to best understand the past? Secondly, how do we best inform policy? First, how do we best understand the past? There's been a lot of chat in this debate about evidence collection. And what the basic problem that the proposition has is they say there's really not much to go on about the entire lives of everyone apart from like half a dozen individuals living in the courts. We believe that in fact there's a wide range of evidence. I know John talked a lot about height data, and that's because I was chatting about my dissertation on New Zealand prisoner height data during prep time, but there's also a whole bunch of other evidence that economic and social historians use all the time. So for example, they use things like import records that show what goods and services were being sold. They use tax data that shows what individuals owned. They use individual records like probate records to show what things that individuals had at the time of their death. They use information like wills. They use the records of the courts that show how people interacted with those and what individual decisions were made. We would posit that even if that information is not clear, it allows us to, in aggregate, get a better understanding of what the overall society looked like than simply looking at what some guy wrote in his diary and having someone interpret that over and over again. we bring more evidence which is more likely to be able to be reproduced across a number of countries and used to compare those countries on an accurate basis, and as a result get a better understanding of what drives differences between countries. Closing government talk a lot about exoticization, but they ignore the fact that you're far more likely to view Polynesian peoples as exotic and different at the point that your only understanding of Maori culture comes from stories told by oral history of great leaders who fought in particular wars, rather than looking at the development of the Maori economy and how it interacted with early settlement in New Zealand. So for example, informing our view of how the Maori were able to act as a dynamic people in response to colonialisation is informed by the fact that in the 1830s, the Maori sold shrunken heads to traders, which wasn't a particular part of their culture before, but was something that they used as an outside economic incentive that drove their society to change. Understanding how societies change and how ordinary people react when they face things like colonialisation, when they face things like invasions or changes in policy, is the most important thing to understanding the truth, which is something that OG identify as being important. What do we then hear from closing? So they say, but it's really important to understand all of the important institutions and great people like, you know, the steam engine, the invention of literacy. Well, unfortunately for them, the spread of literacy throughout early modern Europe wasn't a person or an organisation. It was instead something that was part of everyday lives where people interacted with forms of education, where they gained schooling they wouldn't have otherwise got, and they often pressured to be able to gain access to information that they wouldn't otherwise have. That's something that's on our side of the debate, so just swap over all of the analysis that they gave for us to our side, because that's something that definitely falls on our side of the debate. Eva.
Court records and tax records are newsflash institutional evidence. On our side of the house, we still have all of that. The question is, does the lens ascribe individual lessons and culpability so that going forward, someone is responsible for the policies that caused all of the suffering that both sides are able to demonstrate?
So we don't think it's as important to say, look, Leopold caused all of this harm, as it is to be able to say, look, here are the broad factors which we do have control of, are able to change it in our hands, and here's the broad set of changes that we're able to make in terms of policy that might make a difference. We don't care about ascribing blame or lack of blame to dead people. What we care more about is understanding what broad factors are reproduced in society. Because look, we're not realistically going to be able to do much by ascribing blame to these individuals. I know you talk about some of these individuals being relatively recent or alive or still able to be tried. That's probably something that the courts should do rather than particular historians trawling through that and making judgments for themselves. No, thank you. Now let's look at how this informs policy. We believe that the biggest and most important lessons to be learned from history are things like what we see within development economics about how countries go along their progression of development and become highly developed states. And the way you understand that isn't that the steam engine was invented by one guy and totally revolutionised the world. Many of the changes happened by individuals living their day-to-day lives. Things like individual farmers adopting new technology, things like farmers changing the way that property rights were recognised with respect to agriculture. Those were the important changes, which were the important forces of industrialisation, rather than one-off changes or one-off entrepreneurs who made given decisions. But those individuals often aren't focused on anyway, and we often hear more about politicians who made isolated decisions rather than the things that actually affected people's lives out in rural areas where economic development was crucial for ensuring those people were able to move forward. Yeah.
You want to know pan-Arab nationalism, but whether that anger leads to Bahrain, Tunisia, or Syria depends on institutions like military centralization or rentier oil economies. So ordinary experiences are formed and translated and shaped by the institutions in which they exist.
Yes, but understanding the broad factors leading into those institutions is the key to understanding whether they might be able to be changed and how flexible they are. And also, like many of the things you're identifying as institutions, like being a rentier economy or having your economy set up in a particular way, are very much based on the experiences of individual people, how they interact in the economy. Look, on both sides of the debate, both things are going to be important, whether that's individual great figures who have done things, or whether it's the experiences of people on the ground. This is a debate about what relatively drives forward policy and what's going to have more influence as a result. Understanding that the division of collective plots of agriculture that were prominent in England in the 1600s into individualised plots by about 1750 within areas like Norfolk, and the
which led to the invention of things like crop rotation, is the important factor to understanding the individual decisions which drove forward economic development. Those are the real lessons that we're able to gain, and we gain far more from doing that than simply reading about some guy who lived long ago, who we can't bring back and who isn't going to be relevant anymore.
Thank the opposition whip. Thank all speakers. Of course, shake hands outside.